In Between Wars, 1848 to 1861. Marriage, postings, California, St. Louis, and Galena. In the Mexican War, fighting ended on September 14th, 1847. But the problem was the Mexican government had disappeared. We had to have some sort of treaty to grab the land, and they were gone. There was no one to talk to. The Mexicans finally put some sort of government together because they wanted to get rid of us. Trist and the Mexicans started to negotiate, and in February 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was finalized. But it took until March 10th for the U.S. to ratify it. Mexico ratified it on May 19th, and the treaty went into effect on July 4th, 1848. At that point, the soldiers could leave. While they were waiting for 10 months for the war to get settled, the soldiers became tourists. They visited the caves, they climbed the volcano Popocatépetl, they attended bullfights, they gambled, they started the Aztec Club, and of course, there were women and syphilis. Grant would ride into town every day from Tacubaya to play cards with a fellow soldier named Franklin Pierce. Grant was in his 20s and Pierce was in his 40s, but they were both avid cribbage players with a lot of time to kill. One wonders if people looking at the two of them sitting at the card table together realized they were looking at two future presidents. Finally, the treaty was ratified, everything was over, and it was time to go home. Grant's division was the last one out. He was in Worth's division, and Worth decided that since he was the first one in, he would be the last one out. They left the same way they came in. On their way back, they went up Rio Frio Mountain. If you recall, on the way in, there was a place on the road on the mountain where suddenly the entire Mexico City Valley came into view. They were all awestruck by the sight. You have to think they probably stopped there again on their way out, turned around, and took one last look at Mexico City. Then it was time to go to Puebla, where they stayed for a few months. They probably said goodbye to their old friends, then on past Perote and into Veracruz. They had to leave quickly because of the vomito. From Veracruz, they got on boats and traveled the 880 miles to Pascagoula, Mississippi. Grant arrived in Pascagoula on July 23rd, 1848. He had to find a way to get from Pascagoula to New Orleans so he could catch a boat up the Mississippi. The soldiers, all longing to get home, probably wondered why they just didn't drop him off in New Orleans. The last 680 miles were by steamship from New Orleans to St. Louis. He would blithely float past Vicksburg, Memphis, and Cairo, never anticipating the life-changing events that would happen to him in those locations. When he got to St. Louis, he didn't have to go out to Whitehaven because the Dents were living in town at 4th and Sary Streets. This is a picture of the house that Julia lived in. It was taken later, after the area had deteriorated. He was greeted warmly by the whole family, including Julia's father. The warm greeting might be because Mr. Dent had been involved in an expensive lawsuit for many years and finally lost. That had left him not as well off as he was before. Suddenly, Grant was an okay suitor for his daughter. Grant's appearance had changed. When they last saw him, he was very thin because he had had a virus called Tyler's grip. He was 5'8" and had weighed only 115 pounds. Now he had gained weight, got a tan, and a lot more self-confidence. If they had been at Whitehaven, Grant would have stayed with the family. But because the townhouse was so small, he stayed at the Planters Hotel at 4th and Sary Streets. It was less than 5 blocks from Julia's house. In this picture, the old courthouse is on the left in the foreground, and the Planters Hotel is the next building beyond the courthouse. Grant started courting Julia again, just as he had done 4 years ago. That included long walks, horseback rides, and talking for hours. One of their favorite things to do was to go to the St. Louis Theater. This is the way it looked when they attended. Pretty fancy. Because they weren't married, they always took her younger sister with them. At this theater, they might have seen plays like The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas or Richelieu by Edward Bulwer Lytton. Grant decided he had to go to Bethel before the wedding. To get there, he went down the Mississippi to the junction of the Ohio River. That would take him past Paducah, Cape Girardeau, and other places that would figure so prominently in the Civil War. Then it was up the Ohio River to Bethel. The journey was 600 miles. This painting was made of Jesse and Hannah Grant's house in Bethel before it was torn down. Grant went there before the wedding, probably to convince his parents to attend the wedding. He was not successful. The old abolitionist Jesse Grant was not going to attend a wedding with slaves in the household. They did, however, invite Ulysses and his bride to come for a long visit after the wedding. The wedding took place on August 22nd, 1848, at 8 o'clock in the evening. It was a hot, sultry evening. The Dents provided refreshments in the back parlor. Julia was going to wear a plain wedding dress, but Mrs. O'Fallon, one of the richest women in St. Louis, surprised her with a beautiful white watered silk dress. If you recall, it was at the O'Fallon house that Julia was staying for a long visit before she came home to find Grant as a regular guest at Whitehaven. Groomsmen included James Longstreet, Cadmus Wilcox, and Bernard Pratt, all of whom would oppose Grant on the battlefield in the Civil War. Julia's bridesmaids were her best friend and her sister. No wedding pictures were taken, so this is actually Queen Victoria and Albert. However, there are similarities. Grooms were in uniform, the wedding dresses were white, and the guests wore 1840s fashion. Before the white wedding dresses came into style, the bride just wore the best thing in her closet, or purchased a new dress that would serve her after her wedding. Most weddings were small affairs in the home with some light refreshments. In the history books, there is controversy about whether James Longstreet was Grant's best man at the wedding. One good source to clear this up is a book called Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. He talked to some Confederate generals after the war while researching his book. They described Longstreet's reaction to Grant being moved to the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. According to the generals, Longstreet expressed this opinion of Grant. "Do you know Grant?" "Well, I do. I was in the Corps of Cadets with him at West Point for 3 years. I was present at his wedding. I've served in the same army with him. I have observed his methods of warfare in the West, and I believe I know him through and through, and I tell you we cannot afford to underrate him and the army he now commands." From this, it looks like Longstreet was present at the wedding, but maybe not as best man. The day after the wedding, the young couple left for a honeymoon in Bethel, Ohio. The trip by steamship was Julia's very first ride on a boat. In her autobiography, she recalled, "How I marveled at this great creature as I felt it to be gliding so swiftly along, obeying the slightest motion of a hand in the pilot house. It seemed to me almost human, breathing and panting and obedient to man's will. I enjoyed sitting alone with Ulysses. This was very, very pleasant. He asked me to sing to him, something low and sweet, and I did as he requested." Ulysses was looking forward to having Julia meet all of his relatives. He didn't seem to hold it against his parents for not attending the wedding. The one thing that marred the trip was that they stopped and visited some of Grant's wealthier relatives in Maysville, Ohio. They were welcomed by these relatives and were entertained very well. But 50 years later, Julia still was upset that they didn't offer to help Ulysses get into business. She said that her dear husband had intimated very modestly that if he saw a chance for business opening, he would be glad to resign. And all these gentlemen had business connections in New Orleans, New York, Liverpool, and in Paris. Not one of them offered even to introduce him to any businessman. She did not forget it when her lieutenant was general in chief and when he was president of the United States. How these same friends petitioned him for favors. Needless to say, Grant's kindness to them irked her. Of course, if they'd been kind, he would have never been president. Then it was time to meet the parents. They arrived in Bethel to a warm welcome. Grandmother Simpson had made a special trip to town to be there. Ulysses and his grandmother seemed to have a special relationship, even though she was just a step grandmother. The visit lasted 3 months. Julia said they were busy visiting humble and not so humble relatives and friends. There is some controversy on how warm the welcome was. The evidence is that she did get a good welcome. Julia was willing to go back and do a month-long visit with them by herself and even have her second child at their house. Later, during the Civil War, when she was homeless and visiting with 4 children, it did get tense with one of Grant's unmarried sisters. They returned to Julia's home another 600 miles to give her a chance to say goodbye to everyone, gather her things, and head out for his first posting after the Mexican War. It suddenly dawned on her that she was going to be leaving permanently. She loved her childhood home, and the thought of leaving it was gut wrenching. She started crying copious tears. Julia describes what happened next. He, meaning Grant, was telling me how troubled he was, and that for 4 years he had anticipated how pleasant it would be for us to spend our days together, and here at the end of the first 3 months I was relenting. They were upstairs sitting together when Julia's father appeared. He proposed a solution. Grant, he said, I could arrange it all for you. You join your regiment and leave Julia with us. You can get a leave of absence once or twice a year and run off here and spend a week or two with us. I always knew she could not live in the army. Julia continues. Ulysses, with his arm around me, bent his head and whispered, Would you like this, Julia? Would you like to remain with your father and let me go alone? She cried, No, I could not. I would not do that for a moment. Then he said, Dry your tears and do not weep again. It's making me unhappy. That settled it, Julia says, thanks to her father's suggestion. Before we take Ulysses and Julia to his first assignment, let's take a look at that army pay she was going to have to live on. A lot of historians talk about the low pay second lieutenants received. We can compare it with some other professions and what they were making. He got $30 a month for base pay and 4 rations that were worth $24. I'm not sure if they gave him the money or if they let them shop at the base exchange or if they just gave him a box of food. Although there was no money allowed for horses, a second lieutenant was allowed $15.50 for a servant. It would seem strange for a second lieutenant to have a servant today, but remember they didn't have dishwashers, washing machines, dryers, and so on. That added up to $69.50 per month. Enlisted men received only $13 per month and no money for servants. Lieutenants' pay equaled 5 times enlisted men's. The average pay for most Americans was between $8 and $30 a month. Therefore, a second lieutenant was definitely in the upper class. Finally, in September, Grant was able to extract Julia out of her childhood home and away from her parents. They were headed for his assignment at Fort Wayne near Detroit. Since Bethel was only 25 miles out of their way, they stopped and visited her parents again. Grant had requested and received another 2 months' leave, which they spent at Jesse and Hannah's. They visited everybody again. Back in the 1800s, visiting with guests was one of the few forms of entertainment as well as news. Because there was no phones, the visits were mostly pop-ins. You had to keep your parlor presentable at all times. Bethel was 250 miles from their destination in Fort Wayne near Detroit. This is an overview of Fort Wayne and the Detroit area. The fort was on the border between Canada and the US to protect from British raids. In this area, the United States is actually north of Canada, which always seems a little strange. The Detroit River runs out of Lake St. Clair and into Lake Erie. Lake Erie is the blue water on the lower right-hand corner of the map. This is a close-up of the way the fort looks today. Construction started in 1843 and was done by 1851. It was what was called a star fort, usually made out of dirt to begin with. They started with a rectangle and then protruded the corners out, and that way they could shoot effectively down the entire length of the wall. Sometimes there was a triangle built against the walls on the outside for additional protection, and they let privates sleep out there. There's also an example of a star fort in Fort Union in New Mexico. This is one of the remaining buildings on the fort. It served as sleeping quarters for enlisted men. Each section held 100 men with mess on the bottom floor and sleeping quarters and open rooms on the next two floors. There were no openings between the sections to prevent fires from moving from one section to the other. The latrine was located in another building. When they arrived, they found that Lieutenant Henry Wallen had prevailed on Colonel William Whistler to retain him in Detroit and send Ulysses to Sackett's Harbor. Colonel Whistler was the uncle of the painter James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Ulysses obeyed orders, but let it be known that he would send a remonstrance to Washington, D.C. With his position as regimental quartermaster, he needed to be at headquarters. Whistler told him he was no longer quartermaster. They had a long, fatiguing, and expensive trip to Sackett's Harbor. They would have gone by boat, but navigation was closed and they had to hire any conveyance they could to reach this out of the way place. Julia said it was expensive and miserable. After they arrived, Grant made a remonstrance to Army headquarters. This gives you an idea of the additional travel they had to do under winter conditions. They had to travel the entire length of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario by land. In navigation season, they would have sailed on a more comfortable boat all the way from Fort Wayne to Madison Barracks. This is a present-day picture of Madison Barracks. They're located on the east tip of Lake Ontario with a village nearby called Sackett's Harbor. Following the conclusion of the War of 1812, the barracks were built to keep the British out. This was once considered one of the most scenic military posts in the entire country. On arrival, Grant sent a remonstrance to Washington. Then it was time to begin the start of their married life and housekeeping together. When they were about to have their first dinner, Grant came home and announced that he had invited 3 single officers for dinner. Julia went ballistic. She wasn't confident enough to have company yet. She told Grant that she didn't know if their cook could cook. Grant replied that he thought all cooks could cook. Julia straightened him out on that, and he had to go and uninvite the officers who went without dinner that night. The second night, the officers were invited again, and they all knocked timidly at the door, asking if it was really okay for them to come inside. Julia and Grant love having company. They made lots of new friends and were really enjoying Sackett's Harbor when news came from Washington that Grant's protest was upheld and they were going back to Fort Wayne. Since they were having such a good time, they asked that the return trip be postponed until navigation was open on the Great Lakes. This time, as they were leaving, Julia cried about leaving her new friends. Grant rented a house at 253 Fort Street. Julia asked for and got an allowance for household expenses. However, she wasn't the best at accounting, and she often asked Grant to help fix her account book. He would tell her that he could not make out her mathematical conundrums and offered to make up the money she needed. Since the British weren't causing any trouble, they had lots of free times for parties, fishing, and visiting. Julia was pregnant, and when she was nearing her confinement, the doctor sent her home to be with her parents. This is the picture of 253 4th Street, where the Grants lived. It was probably taken after he became famous. It looks like a good sized house, and Julia claimed it was very charming and elegant inside. The baby was born in St. Louis and named after Julia's father. I think Grant was surprised that she did that. It was almost like they had not talked about it before the birth. The next one, he made sure it was named after him. After the baby was old enough to travel, Grant came down and got them. This time, to save money, they messed with their friends, the Gores. By messing, I mean they shared rent, servant expenses, fuel, and food. Each family had their own carriages and baby nurses. This could be a situation where you could get on each other's nerves, but they enjoyed each other's company. With the workload light at the base, Major Gore and Ulysses joined several clubs. The clubs required each member to give a dinner once a year. The husbands were going to a lot of dinners. Julia and Mrs. Gore decided that women need to have some fun too. The husbands suggested that the ladies give a ball. They were delighted with the idea and started planning it. Julia and Mrs. Gore sent out some beautiful invitations to the ball. At the last minute, they decided to make it a fancy dress ball, which back then meant a costume party. The whole community got engaged in choosing characters to be and making costumes. They had to get creative because there weren't a lot of stores in Detroit. Julia decided to go as the Tambourine Girl, and Mrs. Gore was the Sultana of Turkey. Captain Gore wore a turban of white gauze and a broken mirror in the shape of a crescent. Of course, Ulysses would only wear his uniform. On the morning of the ball, Major Gore asked the ladies where they wanted the table for refreshments. Both ladies realized they had completely forgotten to get any refreshments. Grant and Major Gore went down to a local hotel to order refreshments and servers. The Sunday before the ball, an incident occurred that marred their happiness. The ministers of the Catholic and Presbyterian churches spoke to the congregations about the sin of frivolity. Julia said this was entirely unlooked for. She had no idea that costume parties were viewed as fundamentally wrong. They could not believe a simple costume party meant to relieve the boredom and give people some fun was looked on as sinful. Parishioners of those churches did not attend the actual party, but did gather outside in the plaza. Despite all this, the party was a great success and talked about for weeks. The two people in this picture are dressed up in costumes for a party in the 1850s. It shows the type of costumes that were popular back then. I hope the two people in the picture did not end up in a very warm place over participating in such frivolity. On June 12th, 1851, the whole regiment was told that Fort Wayne was closing and they would have to go to different forts. The Grants were thrilled that they got to go back to Sackett's Harbor. Ulysses went in June, but Julia took Fred home for the summer. In September, he wrote for her to return. He said he really missed Fred, and she thought he mentioned maybe her too. She had to make the trip by herself without a nurse. This was very harrowing for Julia. Ulysses was supposed to have met her along the way, but he never showed up. When she arrived at Sackett's Harbor, it was the middle of the night. She had to get the guard to let her in. The guard sent for Grant, who came rushing out to meet them. It turns out that the message had not been received. It arrived the next day. During this period, Grant again had time to join several clubs. One of the clubs was the Sons of Temperance. This has been used by many historians to prove he was an alcoholic. When writing about Grant, some historians take the stance that he was an alcoholic. They will throw in everything that proves he was and leave out anything that proves he wasn't. Let's take a look at the Temperance Society to see if you think it was a club for alcoholics. Keep in mind that there was an anti alcohol movement in the whole country at that time. The Temperance Society was popular and eventually, okay, stop. There was a highly restricted membership. You had to be nominated by one brother and investigated by three others to prove you had high moral character. The initiation fee of $2 was equal to a week's wages for poorer people. It was most likely an upper class organization. The benefits were the dinners, burial insurance for husband and wife, and visitors if you were sick. All club members were required to visit the sick once a day. And imagine having 20 people come to your house every day if you had a sick husband. Might be a problem. As a member, you had to be aware that a fellow member was ill. You had to know the secret rituals, the hand grips, and the passwords. All members were expected to buy the regalia and the uniforms. This appears to me to be just another lodge with a good cause. Gold was discovered in 1848. This was to change Ulysses's life forever. With no government and no law, gold miners clashed with each other and Native Americans. The army was needed to keep the peace in California until civilian governments could be installed. In April, the official order came from Washington that the whole regiment was going to California. The regiment was to be sent to Governor's Island and New York's harbor to await transportation. Julia was 8 months pregnant. She was excited about going, but Grant determined that it would be too dangerous. She was very upset, but he begged her not to grieve. He told her that it took robust health to cross the Isthmus of Panama, and even if she made it, they would not be able to survive on his salary out there. He knew she would need servants and a nurse for the children. He sent her home, first to visit his parents, where she had the baby, and then on to her parents in St. Louis. She had to have known the baby was going to be born at Jesse and Hannah's home. The fact that she was willing to give birth there seems to prove that she had a good relationship with them at the time. While waiting to be shipped out, Grant took a quick trip to Washington. He could not rest until the $1,000 he had had stolen from him in Mexico was off his record. But because Henry Clay had died and everything was shut down for the funeral, he made no progress. What congressman he could talk to told him that the military committee was the only entity that could do something for him, and they would not meet until after Grant returned to New York. He headed back to New York, still owing the $1,000. This is a Currier and Ives drawing of the ship Grant took to the Panama Canal. Grant wrote Julia that there were 5 women on board, but he thought they would soon regret being there. At the last minute, the War Department had booked passage for the regiment to sail on the Ohio. They booked it 2 days before it was to sail, and there was absolutely no room for them. The whole thing shows the incompetence of the people in the War Department. The Ohio could accommodate 250 people in cabins and 80 in steerage, but these berths had already been booked by gold seekers. Where would the 700 service members and their families stay? Grant's challenge would be to find spaces for nearly 700 additional passengers, and he only had 2 days to do it. He began by building rows of berths on deck. Not everyone could be accommodated. It was a miserable trip for everyone. Passengers reported that the regiment's commander was testy and had many disagreements, which Grant was called on to smooth over. I found a short newspaper article about the Ohio stopping in at a port in Virginia. The description of the cargo gives you an idea of what was going on. On board, there was $1,700,000 worth of gold as freight, 361 passengers with 600,000 in gold in their hands. At least somebody was getting rich. It took 11 miserable days before the overloaded Ohio reached the company town of Aspinwall in Panama. Passengers were met by a foot or more of water in the streets. They had to walk on elevated boardwalks. Grant wondered how people could live in Aspinwall for many months and why would anybody try. Grant's job was to supervise the unloading of passengers and the equipment and to find a place to store equipment above the water. He had to spend some of the government's money on renting buildings to keep the equipment dry. The Aspinwall Company had contracts to take Americans and regimental baggage across the isthmus. Single men went ahead to Panama City. Grant was left behind with the family's baggage and one company to help him. The doctor also accompanied him. First, they boarded a small train, hotter than an oven, to get as far as the Chagres River. Then they boarded bungos, which were hollowed out logs pushed by natives through the jungle on the river, and as Grant said in his personal memoirs, they were not inconveniently burdened with clothing. At night, the natives who were pushing the boats left their passengers and went into a village bar to have a good time. The people were left sitting all night in boats, listening to jungle sounds, and were terrified. At Cruces, mules had been hired by the army to take them to Panama City, but the contractor said the mules were not there yet. Every day for a week he repeated that. This went on forever. Then people started dying of cholera. Grant got fed up. He went to town on his own recognizance and used his Spanish to arrange to hire mules and litter carriers from the locals. He didn't care at what price. Once they got the mules and headed to Panama, people still kept dying along the way. One half of the people with Grant died, including all the children under 2. He knew he had made the right decision about Julia and Fred. Once they got to the ship that was to take them to California, the captain wouldn't let anyone who was sick on board. They found out that single soldiers had gotten cholera too. Grant had to turn an old barge into a hospital ship and wait for a few weeks for people to recover. If only people back then knew about these creatures and knew to boil water. It took several weeks to finally get going because of the illness. Altogether, about 150 from the regiment died. One of the last persons to die was Grant's friend, Major Gore. They were playing cards on board the ship when Gore fell ill. They tried to reassure him by saying it was just the food that had disagreed with him. 6 hours later, he was dead. Mrs. Gore was along, and Grant wrote Julia that she took it really hard. Grant arranged for a lieutenant to escort her back to the States. Not only had she lost her husband, now she had to retrace the dangerous journey that had killed him. He was their very last death. Grant wrote to his father and sister and asked them to visit her. So he must have known the Gores before he went into the service, because they lived so close to his parents' house. On top of everything else, Grant was accused by a paper in Panama of leaving the sick in Cruces and going alone to Panama City. This was entirely untrue. Too many witnesses, including the doctor who wrote a report to Washington, denied this. The doctor's report and people in the regiment mentioned what a great help Grant was in tending the sick. It appears the Aspinwall Company wanted to shift blame because they did not fulfill their contract and so many people had died. The story was picked up by several papers in the States, and even Julia read it. As usual for Grant, he refused to defend himself. His fellow officers wrote up a defense explaining what really happened and sent it to newspapers. It was thought that if the Confederate States had gotten hold of this version by the Aspinwall papers during the Civil War, they would have attacked Grant on that basis. They never found it. In his personal memoirs, Grant adds a little levity with what he calls his humorous story. While waiting at anchor for people to get over cholera, Grant meets Lieutenant John Slaughter on the boat. Slaughter was very susceptible to seasickness, especially at anchor. Even the wave of a tablecloth induced seasickness in him. He told Grant his story. He was on his third trip to or from California. After graduation from West Point, he was sent around the Horn, and it took 7 months, and he was sick every minute. Arriving in California, he got orders that had come through the Isthmus that California was a mistake and that he was ordered back to the Northern Lakes. At the Northern Lakes, the Army changed its mind and said this time for real he needed to be in California. He started back by the Isthmus. It was his third trip. Grant remembered him well. Elbows on the table, the picture of despair. At last he broke out, I wish I had taken my father's advice. He wanted me to go into the Navy. If I had done so, I should not have gone to sea so much. Grant ends the story with, poor Slaughter, it was his last voyage. He was killed by the Indians in Washington. Soldiers were allowed to explore San Francisco. Grant found it a lively place. He concluded that many of the real scenes in early Californian life exceeded in strangeness and interest any of the mere products of the brain of the novelist. He explored the town and won $40 at faro. Daily boats from Stockton and Sacramento brought in miners who came to sell their dust and have a time. Grant noticed the different types of people there. Some belonged to a class of good manners and good upbringing who had been cared for and educated by their parents who could no longer afford to support them as adults. Grant thought that the ones who figured out something useful to do and were willing to work probably made it. But there were some who had never worked and did not want to start now. They were ever on the alert to make the acquaintance of people with some ready means, in the hope of being asked to take a meal at a restaurant. He thought that many of those now fill unknown graves. Others died wrecks of their former selves, and many, without a vicious instinct, became criminals and outcasts. Grant's regiment spent a few weeks at Bernicia Barracks outside of San Francisco and then was ordered to Vancouver on the Columbia River, then an Oregon territory. Vancouver was about 100 miles inland from the small village of Portland across the river. The Hudson Bay Company was a stone's throw away, as Grant put it. He admired the company for the fair way they treated Indians in trading and their willingness to provide hospitals for sick Indians, which saved many lives. This is a drawing of the Hudson Bay Company with Columbia Barracks in the background. Columbia Barracks was established to provide protection and encourage Americans to settle in the area. In addition to keeping the peace, they had to supply Pacific Railroad surveying parties with horses, equipment, and rations for their journey into the interior of the country. Congress was contemplating building a railroad to Oregon, but there was too much contention about what sections of the country to bring it through. So it was decided to let the Army survey the area and they would make the decision on the best route. One of the tasks that Grant completed was rounding up to 200 horses for the McClellan surveying party. This is the same McClellan who was appointed General-in-Chief of the Union Army during the Civil War. This map shows the fort in relation to the Columbia River. Grant lived in a nice house called the Quartermaster Ranch with 5 other people, including Rufus Ingalls and a young couple, the Sheffields, who were their hired servants. The group ate together every night, creating a family-like atmosphere. Grant was sad, missing his family, but didn't appear to be going off the deep end. Mrs. Sheffield told the story of him requesting sweet butter because he really missed it. She had never made butter before, so she put sugar in it since he wanted sweet butter. She still remembered the looks on everyone's faces when they tasted the butter, and Grant saying, Mrs. Sheffield, that is the sweetest butter I have ever tasted. Grant did not participate in the main pastime, which was hunting. He was just not a hunter. His main entertainment was taking long rides, usually with Rufus Ingalls. He visited and got to know some Indian tribes personally. Julia was worried that he might be in danger riding by himself with the Indians around. Grant replied to Julia's concerns that the Indians about here are the most harmless people you ever saw. It is really my opinion that the whole race would be harmless and peaceable if they were not put on by whites. He had not seen Julia since July. She was 8.5 months pregnant at the time. Here's a letter to Julia dated October 26, 1852, 3 months since he's seen her. My dearest Julia, another mail has arrived, and not one word have I got from you. I have not heard a single word from you since the 1st of July. I know, though, dearest, that you have written often, but your letters being directed to other parts of the country, I do not get them. I am in hopes the next mail will bring me several letters. I am very anxious to hear from our little ones and from you, dear, dear Julia. In this letter, he was upset that he had heard nothing from any member of his family for 3 months. He didn't know if the birth had gone well or even if the baby or Julia had survived. It was driving him crazy. This is the Grant House today at Fort Vancouver. It actually belonged to the base commander. The base commander committed suicide in the house even though he had his family with him. Remote forts can get very depressing. Grant's state of mind at Fort Vancouver was sad but not over the edge. He was sad to be away from the family, but not totally depressed either. But he was a family man and could not help missing his wife and children. A Sergeant Theodore Eckerson encountered Grant one day and proudly showed him a letter containing a promotion. Grant pulled out his own letter of several pages and, after opening it to the last page, showed the sergeant the penciled outline of a baby's hand. He said nothing, but Eckerson watched him tremble as his eyes welled with tears. Mail delivery was very unreliable. Another thing that got to soldiers was that they never knew that when the assignment would end and they would see their families again. I believe today, if we're not engaged in a war, soldiers are given a time when the remote assignment will end. Grant could not see the end of it. December 3rd. You can scarcely conceive how this mail's arrival has made me feel. It not only brought me a letter from you, but 4 letters. I am so glad too, dear Julia, to hear that our little other one is such a fine, healthy boy. Note that Ulysses was born July 22nd, and he had just found out about it over 4 months later. It was tough. The letters must have made him beside himself with joy. This is what the inside of the fort looked like. Grant's job was to help outfit McClellan with 200 horses and 3 months' rations. You can imagine what the fort and the surroundings looked like with the explorers there, along with all the horses and food and equipment the quartermasters helped furnish. During this time was the first you heard that Grant might have been drunk. According to one of Grant's housemates, Henry Hodges, he went on a little spree during the time that McClellan was there, which might account for McClellan refusing to see him at the beginning of the Civil War when he was applying for a position in the Army. Of course, he completed the job just fine, and nothing was ever recorded in official records. Grant got special attention later in life because he was so famous. Men at this base were away from civilization and their families for years. It would be surprising if every man didn't have a binge or two during that time. Of course, historians mention that this possible incident and never mention what a bad job McClellan did on the survey. Instead of surveying and comparing different routes, he chose the first one he looked at and looked no further. The governor of Oregon was very upset with him and asked to read McClellan's journals of the exploration, but McClellan wouldn't allow it. Shortly after that, other people found much better routes for a railroad. Grant and some other officers decided to try to make some money. First, they decided to raise a crop. They thought they could make a handsome profit by sending vegetables to San Francisco. They invested in expensive seeds and horses. Then Grant did the plowing. But the Columbia River flooded that year, ruining everything. Grant said it was a good thing. It saved them from harvesting the crop. It turned out that everyone else had the same idea, and there was a glut of vegetables on the market. Next, Grant and friends cut 100 tons of ice to ship to San Francisco. It melted when the ship was held up with bad winds. After that, they tried the farm animals: chickens, cows, sheep. You guessed it, they all died before the ship made it to San Francisco. Then a group invested in a billiards club where high class miners could get away from the ordinary rabble in San Francisco. The operator they hired ran off with the funds. While in San Francisco, Grant deposited money in a bank. A mattress would have been better. All those money making schemes were with other officers. The worst one Grant did all by himself. Elijah Camp, someone Grant had met at Sackett's Harbor, proposed a business deal. Grant would supply the startup funds for a sutler store and he would run it. Elijah would pay Grant back and share the profits. After a time, Elijah came by and said he wasn't making anything and he would pay Grant back his share. He paid him not in cash but in notes. Then later he came by and asked Grant to burn the notes because he felt bad about having them in existence. Grant did so. According to Julia, her reaction was, "I chided Euless when he told me this, telling him that the vicar of Wakefield's Moses was the financier beside him." Grant opened a letter from Secretary of War Jefferson Davis dated August 9, 1853, informing him that he had been promoted to captain. Soon after, he was instructed to report to Fort Humboldt in California to assume command of Company F of the 4th Infantry. He had to say his goodbyes. In an interview, Mrs. Sheffield said, "He gave me his famous cookbook, feather pillows, and a number of other small articles. He gained the friendship and goodwill of his men by his constant and watchful care of their interests," she added, "and had not made an enemy, and was kind and considerate to all." Fort Humboldt was on the coast near Eureka, California. It was protected by a barrier island. Because it was so difficult for sailing ships to enter the openings between the island and the coast, the journey between San Francisco and Fort Humboldt could vary between 2 and 60 days. It was much more remote, only a few villages along the coast. He was no longer quartermaster. Instead, he had command of a company. It was a beautiful location, but scenery gets old if that's all there is. In addition to protecting local inhabitants, the fort's mission was to act as a supply depot for posts around California and Oregon. Grant arrived on January 5, 1854. He had drug his feet. He took 3 months to get there. Before he could leave Columbia Barracks, he had to get his quartermaster accounts in order. Then it took a while to catch a ship and travel to San Francisco. When he was in the city again, it could be at this time that he went in with some other officers on the Gentlemen's Club. That was the one where their employee ran off with the money. Fort Humboldt was brand new, and the buildings were rather rough. It was located in a beautiful location if you wanted it for a summer home with a great ocean view and old growth thick pine forests behind it. All sorts of wildlife, including grizzly bears, were around. Great for the hunters, not much for Grant to do. There were rumors that Major Buchanan was going to be transferred and that Grant, as captain, would have command of the base. Robert Buchanan may be one of the reasons Grant wanted to remain in Vancouver. A friend of his, Lieutenant Lewis Hunt, wrote to Grant that the fort was bad and the commanding officer was even worse. Hunt asked Grant to see if his father-in-law would put in a good word to his senator friend Benton to help get Hunt a promotion and get him out of that base. And you recall that Buchanan and Grant had had words at Jefferson Barracks when Grant was a lieutenant. Grant had talked back and Buchanan wasn't happy. Some historians think Buchanan still had it out for Grant because of that. Would Buchanan remember a little tiff with Grant after all these years? They'd even been in the Mexican War together. The only thing he wrote to Julia that even mentioned Buchanan was in this line: Colonel Buchanan, the doctor, and myself lived together at an expense of about $50 per month each, including servant hire and washing. Mr. Hunt lives by himself. Grant never said anything negative about Buchanan in his letters to Julia. Grant sent money to have this photo taken. In a letter dated March 21st, 1853, "Can't you have your daguerreotype taken with Fred and Eunice along?" This was one of the few pictures she had taken not in profile because of her eyes. She probably thought only Grant would ever see it. Having the picture sent appeared to backfire. Instead of cheering him up, the picture broke his heart. He got to see very clearly what he was missing. Fred was now a little boy instead of a toddler. Did he remember his dad? And Eunice was already a toddler, so he had missed seeing him as a baby. How much would they change before he got to see them again? How much of their lives would go forward without him? Would this assignment ever end? Grant seemed to fall into a severe depression. It had been a year and a half since he had seen his family and no end in sight. There were fewer people and friends at this post, and a martinet was in charge. There were rumors that his company was moving to an even more remote post called Fort Jones, 100 miles east of Fort Humboldt, in the mountains with miserable accommodations and only a stagecoach route for mail. December 19th, 1853. I would prefer sacrificing my commission and try something to continuing this separation. February 2nd, 1854. You do not know how forsaken I feel here. The place is good enough, but I have interest at others which I cannot help thinking about day and night. Then, too, it is a long time since I made application for orders to go on to Washington to settle my accounts, but not a word in reply do I get. Then I feel again as if I had been separated from you and Fred long enough. And as to Euless, I have never seen him. I do nothing but sit in my room and read and occasionally take a short ride on one of the public horses. So he is hoping to get to Washington and then go by St. Louis, grab his family, and escort them out to Eureka, or possibly just see them one more time. February 6, 1854. A mail come in this evening, but brought me no news from you, nor nothing in my application for orders to go home. I cannot conceive what is the cause of the delay. The state of suspense that I am in is scarcely bearable. I think I have been from my family quite long enough, and sometimes I feel as though I could almost go home nolens volens. Nolens volens was used to mean absent without leave. March 25th, 1854, 17 days away from resignation. How very anxious I am to get home once again. I do not feel as if it is possible to endure this separation much longer. But how do I know that you are thinking of me as much as I of you? They both had feelings of insecurity during the separation, In one letter, he told her to ignore people who were teasing her that he was making love to a Mexican girl out in Oregon, adding, if they knew their history, they would know there are no Mexican girls in Oregon. March 25th, 1854. He talks resignation. I sometimes get so anxious to see you and our little boys that I am almost tempted to resign and trust to Providence and my own exertions for a living where I can have you and them with me. Whenever I get to thinking upon the subject, however, poverty begins to stare me in the face, and then I think, what would I do if you and our little ones should want for the necessaries of life? He appears to be losing his self confidence, but he has so many talents. He has people skills. He's college educated. He was trained as an engineer. There were very few engineers in this country. He was a good writer. He was an artist. He was a mathematician. Now he's not saying, if I fail, the world is wide, like he did when he first started West Point as a 17-year-old. What has happened in California to destroy his self esteem? Is the company moving? Another March 25th, 1854. It is very much to be feared that even this last place is to be abandoned for another in the interior where none or but very poor quarters will be found. The best we can expect is to go to Fort Jones, where the buildings were hastily run up by the soldiers. They are just rough log pens, covered over with places for a door and window, but left without these luxuries as well as without floors. Rumors were that they were going to be moved to a more isolated and primitive Fort Jones with no hope of frequent mail delivery. Between this letter and his resignation, he did apply to Fort Jones. He had agreed to trade with someone there and was ordered there after he left. Was this a last-ditch effort to get out from under Buchanan? This is where Fort Jones was located. It was about 100 miles from Fort Humboldt. There were rugged mountains between the two forts. The fort was close to a stage route, but no luxury of ships would get you there and back. March 25th, 1854 again. Here he indicated that he had moved out of Buchanan's quarters. Here we are, better off having each 2 comfortable rooms plastered with brick chimney to each. Mr. Hunt and myself live together, and I think we'll be able to try bringing our mess bills down to a moderate rate. Did he move out to be away from Buchanan? Or maybe it was just that the doctor's wife, who was expected, moved in. Now the tone changes a little bit. March 25th, 1854. I could be contented if at Humboldt, if it was possible to have you here, but it is not. You could not do without a servant, and a servant you could not have. This is bad, is it not? But you never complain about being lonesome, so I infer that you are quite contented. I dreamed of you and our little boys the other night for the first time in a long time. I thought you were at a party when I arrived, and before paying any attention to my arrival, you said you must go because you were engaged for a dance. Nervous breakdowns can cause a range of physical, emotional, and behavioral symptoms. Let's look at some of them. There's anxiety and depression, feeling overwhelmed, hopeless, or helpless, irritability, feeling angry, frustrated, or having emotional outbursts. I think I saw some of those in the letter. Physical symptoms, he was lethargic. He wasn't going anyplace, just sitting in his room reading. Behavior symptoms, avoiding social situations, neglecting self-care, not showering, eating unhealthy foods, not exercising. Okay. He appears to have some of these symptoms. He finally resigned, totally broke. He was too sick to leave for a month. What was going on there? He had to borrow money to get back to New York. You would think the Army might help him since they got him out there. If he was drinking, does self medicating with alcohol mean that you're an alcoholic? This letter is dated April 11th, 1854. I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of my commission as captain in the 4th Infantry and my acceptance of the same. I very respectfully tender my resignation of my commission as an officer of the Army and request that it may take effect from the 31st July next. Buchanan endorsed Grant's letter of resignation and recommended that he receive the leave that he requested. He recommended that the resignation be accepted, offered no separate report. Was this a kindness? He could have recommended that the resignation not be accepted, but he did not. Okay, so what are the possible reasons for his resignation? 1, found drunk at the pay table. This is the one that was popular with the rumors. Buchanan had given him a choice of resigning or undergoing a court-martial trial for being drunk on duty. He supposedly resigned because he couldn't have his wife ever know that he was tried on such a charge. There is no evidence for this other than rumors. Nothing was written down, especially nothing was written down by people who were at the fort. Only people who were not at the fort wrote about it. Okay, 2, missing his family. He was writing that he was going to resign. There were several letters that said he was thinking of resigning. Did he just carry out his threat to resign because he wanted to see his family? Okay, 3, was Buchanan such a martinet that he couldn't bear to work under him anymore? He did apply for Fort Jones, a terrible post during this time. Had he a complete breakdown? Was it functioning? If this was the case, why didn't they help him get home? Nothing official has ever been written about why Grant resigned. No eyewitnesses ever wrote anything. The people who did write the rumors were not at the base. This is Rufus Ingalls. He was one person we can actually trace the rumors to. He was a friend of Grant's, a quartermaster with Grant at Fort Vancouver, and a former West Point roommate. He later supported Grant during the Civil War as the Army of the Potomac's quartermaster. In a private letter to a friend, Rufus suggested that Grant finding himself in dreary surroundings without his family and with but little to occupy his attention, fell into dissipated habits and was found one day too much under the influence of liquor to properly perform his duties. But keep in mind, Rufus had only heard this. He was not at the fort to actually see it. This is the last letter to Julia from California. Fort Humboldt, California, May 2nd, 1854. Dear wife, I do not propose writing you but a few lines. I have not yet received a letter from you, and as I have a leave of absence and will be away from here in a few days, do not expect to. After receiving this, you may discontinue writing, because before I could get a reply, I shall be on my way home. You might write directly to the city of New York. It will require my presence in California for some 4 to 6 weeks to make all my arrangements, public and private, before starting. I may have to go to Oregon before leaving. I will not go, however, unless I get an order to cover my transportation. On my way, I shall spend a week or 10 days with John Dent. My love to all at home. Kiss our little boys for their pa. Love to you, dear Julia, your affectionate husband, Euless. Okay, this letter did not tell the truth. His resignation was not a leave of absence. And we don't know why he had to stay so long. Did it really take that long to get his affairs in order to leave? And another thing is that it appears that he did not go see John Dent, her brother. John Dent would have given him the money to go home, and he was lacking that money. Back through Panama again. Okay, he was penniless in San Francisco. He had lost money in all the get rich quick schemes, and the army would not pay his way home. It seems a little strange that once the army gets you someplace, it seems like they should pay your way to get back. He had loaned money to people such as Elijah Camp who would not pay him back. He had deposited money in a bank in San Francisco. When he went to the bank, they said they didn't have it. Finally, a friend heard about his problems and found him in a crummy hotel in San Francisco and provided transportation home and money to live on. This is a picture of New York City in the 1850s. He had an uneventful trip back. When he arrived in New York, there was no letter from Julia. He took a trip to see Elijah Camp at Sackett's Harbor to get his money back. But unfortunately, he wrote to Elijah to let him know he was coming, and Elijah took off. He was out of money. He sent a letter to his dad asking for money to get home. While waiting for that, he ran into Simon Bolivar Buckner, an old friend from West Point, who guaranteed his hotel bill. When the money came from his dad, he went to Cincinnati first and visited with his parents. Neighbors said later that his dad was acting very disappointed in him. He finally arrived in St. Louis. When he arrived in Whitehaven, he saw two little boys playing on the porch, who stopped to look at the strange man. In seconds, he was tossing them up in the air and playing with them in joy. Now, that's the usual story you get, but some question about whether the depression continued. Julia said that people who did not know him had said that Grant was slovenly and unkempt when he first returned. She says that was a lie. I think it was a possibility that it might have taken him a while to recover. Grant was living with a lot of disappointment at that time. It was disappointing that he just couldn't continue his military career, but it was impossible being away from his family. And then he had two fathers that he was disappointing. One was Julia's father, Frederick Dent, and the other was his father, Jesse Grant. The two fathers were very different from each other. There was Frederick Dent, who went into the fur trading business as a young man, but had the money to do it because he was born wealthy. He moved to St. Louis, went into land speculation and retail shops. He purchased land all over St. Louis. The family plantation, Whitehaven, at one time had 30 slaves, but he lost a lot of money in a stubborn, years-long lawsuit. He had thousands of dollars tied up in slaves who walked off in 1864. He ended up with his fortune depleted. Jesse Root Grant was born poor. His mother died when he was at the age of 10, and his father sent him out to live and work with other families to earn his keep. He was determined to be successful even as a young child. He was a hard worker. When he lived with the Todd family, whose son later became governor of Ohio, they sent him to school for a term. They didn't have to because he was just working for them, but he impressed them. He learned the skill of tanning on the advice of the Todd family, and he continued self-educating himself so he could write articles for the paper. He ended up with the tannery business, several stores, and 50 employees. After he had been home for a while, his parents asked him to bring Julia and the family up for a visit. They offered him a job, but there was a condition. He was to go to Galena alone, and Julia was to stay with them and learn how to be more frugal and learn to live without slaves. After spending 2 years apart, they were not about to be separated again. they left quickly. They began life together again in the Dent's house. It was a difficult time for Grant because of the politics at that time, and he didn't have a job. As soon as they could, they moved to Wish-ton-Wish, which was the name of Julia's brother's house. Her brother wanted them to live in it while he was in California. Mr. Dent had given Julia 80 acres as a wedding present. Grant decided to make a living by farming that land. While they were at Wish-ton-Wish, their much-loved daughter was born on July 4th, 1855. It was the first time the parents had been together for a birth. Some people in St. Louis said that Grant kept to himself. That would not be like Grant. On July 23rd, 1885, shortly after he died, the local paper interviewed one of the old slaves from the Dent household. This is what Mary Robinson said. While on his farm, Grant entertained a great deal of company, including officers from Jefferson Barracks who called on him frequently. At home, he often expressed his opinion about people, and I never knew him to make a single mistake in judging a man's character. I saw him last at the Lindell Hotel after he had returned from his trip around the world, and he received me very kindly, and it seemed to me that he was mighty glad to see me. This was an interview with Mary Robinson, the St. Louis Republican. This is Wish-ton-Wish, which is a house that belonged to one of Julia's brothers. This is a drawing of it. The name Wish-ton-Wish meant whippoorwill in the native language. Her brother wanted them to live in the house because it would not become so dilapidated if someone was living in it. This is Ellen, who was born on July 4th, 1855. Bruce Catton, the noted Grant biographer, once remarked that Ulysses S. Grant's daughter Nellie had a particularly secure place in his heart. She was his only daughter and was surrounded by affection and attention. Grant was openly demonstrative with Nellie and showed her a quiet consideration that was conspicuous. His fatherly devotion to her was touching to all who observed it. He had a number of nicknames for her, including Missy and Martha Rebecca. In letters he wrote to Julia, he sometimes referred to Nellie with these pet names. This is the house that Grant built. Grant wanted to move closer to his property and also have more independence, so he decided to build a house. He wanted to build a frame house, but his father-in-law insisted on a log house because it would be warmer. As Julia describes it, so the big trees were felled and lay stripped of their boughs. Then came a house raising and a great luncheon. We went to this house before it was finished and lived in it scarcely 3 months. It was so crude and homely, I did not like it at all, but I did not say so. The little house looked so unattractive that we facetiously decided to call it Hardscrabble. They thought it was a nice contrast to the names Whitehaven and Wish-ton-Wish. The Grant family soon moved back to Whitehaven following the death of Julia's mother, Ellen. Julia's father asked them to do that because he was so lonely. Grant tried farming, but it didn't go well. He was short on startup money for seeds and equipment from the beginning. Here is an 1856 letter to his father. If I had an opportunity of getting about $500 for a year at 10%, I have no doubt but it would be of great advantage to me. It is always usual for parents to give their children assistance in the beginning of life, and I am only beginning, though 35 years of age, nearly. And what I ask is not much. The fact is, without means, it is useless for me to go on, and I will have to do what Mr. Dent has given me the permission to do, sell the farm and invest elsewhere. In 1856, there was a late spring freeze that killed almost everything that was planted. And then in the panic year of 1857, grain prices had skyrocketed to $2.19 before, 2.19 a bushel, and the farmers began to purchase land to increase their crop supply, which increased their profits. The high earnings per bushel were actually the result of a war overseas. By 1858, the war was over and grain prices dropped severely to 80 cents a bushel. At that time, everybody in the family got either typhoid or malaria, but it took them months to get well. Grant had fever and ague for a whole year. It didn't keep him off the farm, but it limited what he could do. They finally decided that farming wasn't working. It was the time to make some other living in some other way. They rented the land, sold off the farm equipment at auction. This is a receipt from a pawn shop where Grant hawked his watch to buy Christmas presents in 1857. One winter evening during this time, Ulysses and Julia sat in their parlor discussing what to do next. "We will not always be in this condition," Julia insisted. Her optimism buoyed her husband's spirits. She believed in Ulysses, even when he did not always believe in himself. Mary Robinson remembered Julia's family out at Whitehaven talking about how poorly Ulysses was doing as a breadwinner, implying that he was a loser. Julia got angry and told them that Duddy, that was her pet name for Grant, would be president one day. Everybody laughed. Just as he was beginning to go to a new position with Harry Boggs in real estate, Grant decided to emancipate his slave, William Jones, a 35-year-old man who Colonel Dent had left on the property when he moved into St. Louis. No one knows how Grant got the slave William Jones, but he appeared in court on late March 1859 to sign a manumission document. "I do hereby manumit, emancipate, and set free," said William, "from slavery forever." Beyond these basic facts, the relationship between Grant and Jones is riddled with ambiguity. When did Grant acquire Jones? The statement says he purchased him from Dent. Did he really pay money for Jones, or was he just a gift from his father-in-law? And why did he set him free? What sort of work did Jones do for Grant? What was the relationship between the two men like? Grant could have gotten $800 for Jones. Why would he set him free when he was so desperate for money? The question remains unanswered. Grant and Boggs. This was a real estate business with Julia's cousin, Harry Boggs. But the heavy part of the business was collecting rents, something Grant could never do. To save money, he lived alone in Boggs' spare room and sat near their fire in the winter because his room didn't have any heat, while Julia and the kids stayed at Whitehaven. Business did not go well. Finally, they decided that there was not enough business traffic for the two of them and closed down the company. It's interesting that a few years later, when Grant came as a general, Mrs. Boggs was very concerned that their furniture was not good enough for him. Grant moved the family to town in a house on Barton Street. He traded hardscrabble for this place. The problem was that hardscrabble was free and clear, and this place was still mortgaged. And the owner of the townhouse had paid Grant in notes for hardscrabble, which he never redeemed. When it became clear that the owner couldn't pay off the mortgage, he also refused to leave hardscrabble. It ended up in a lawsuit that lasted until after the Civil War. Now, Grant wrote to his father about this house, Jesse Grant, in March of 1859, describing the accommodations. "We have one spare room and also a spare bed in the children's room, so that we can accommodate any of our friends that are likely to come see us." After Grant left Grant and Boggs, he decided to apply for an opening as county engineer. This is a job that would have been perfect for him. He really worked at it. He got letters of recommendations from 35 of St. Louis's top citizens, judges, college professors, and even the head of the American Medical Association. It really indicates how much he got around and how many people were willing to help him out and thought highly of him. But sadly, the other candidate got it because he was a member of the same party as the majority of the members. Finally, he gets a job at the custom house as a clerk with fairly decent pay. The guy that hired him, though, died within a month, and the new guy fired everybody and brought in his own friends. It was very heartbreaking. This is the last house they lived in St. Louis, 7th and Lynch. Grant was jobless and borrowing money the last year, and the man who was in hardscrabble would not pay up. A lawsuit was initiated but not settled. In describing this home to his brother Simpson on October 24th, Grant stated, "My family are all well and living in our own house. It is much more pleasant than where we lived when you were here, and contains about as much room, practically." So finally, it was time to visit Dad again. This time, he secured a job in the leather shop in Galena, Illinois, probably because the next younger brother, Simpson, was dying of consumption. The whole family was going to be able to move to Galena this time, and to better times. This is the SS Itasca in 1859, docked at St. Paul. It's in the foreground. The family boarded this ship in April 1860 to go to Galena. They brought their own chairs to serve as deck chairs. Little did they know they were heading into much better times. Luckily, the Grants were able to make the whole trip by boat on the Mississippi. The ship would turn up the Galena River and dock in the Galena port when they arrived. Galena had a navigable river to the Mississippi. The boat dock always had several ships waiting to be unloaded. It looked to be the city of the future instead of Chicago. The Grant family carried their chairs and luggage off the boat and took in the town that resembled a Swiss village. The glaciers that had scoured most of the northern U.S. had totally skipped this area. This is the Grant rental home. The Grants rented this house for $100 a year. It was cheap because you had to ascend several hundred stairs from Main Street to reach it. Simpson lived with them, and that helped them make expenses. But one wonders how Simpson made it up all those stairs when he was so sick with TB. Julia describes the nightly ritual when Ulysses returned from work. Every night when Grant was climbing the stairs to get to home, his 2-year-old would greet him with the same greeting. "Hey, mister, do you want to fight?" His father would say, "I do not feel like fighting, Jess, but I can't stand being hectored in this manner by a man of your size." Whereupon, being struck on the knees by his little opponent's fist, he would roll on the floor with Jess in his arms, and after a few struggles, place the little fellow firmly on his breast, saying, "It is not fair to strike when a man's down." The captain would take 20 or more punches from the dimpled fist, and so it went on until he thought Jess had had enough fun, and then he would cry for quarter, saying, "I give up, I give up." Then Jess would proudly step off and help his father to arise. Galena was so steep it required staircases instead of sidewalks between streets. Grant had to climb several sets of these stairs to get home from the store, which is located on Main Street. There are 252 steps from Main Street to the highest street in Galena. This is Main Street, where the Grant store was located in Galena. Galena was a thriving community with shipping and mining as the main industries. This is the leather goods store. The business place was a meeting place of Republicans and abolitionists. Grant heard different viewpoints than in the South. Jesse's terms were strict. Ulysses would earn only $600 the first year. In the second year, if he proved himself, he would be granted an interest in the company. Grant worked hard to pay off his debts in St. Louis the first year. His cousin, who worked there too, said he was well accepted by his younger brothers. He had had so many more experiences than they. When people found out about his travels to the Northeast, to Panama, California, Washington, D.C., and the Mexican War, they wanted to hear about them. Few people traveled back then, and there was no TV or internet to entertain you. After Grant started becoming known during the Civil War, people would come to the store, look in the windows, and try to remember which clerk was now the great general. Grant met a few people who would play important roles in his life in Galena. He met John Rollins at the courthouse while he was measuring a chair to be covered in leather. Rollins was fascinated with the Mexican War and would come to see Grant at the store to hear war stories. He was a self-made man whose father had been an alcoholic. His father died early, and Rollins had to earn money to support his mother and siblings. Instead of going to school, he studied the law books by himself to become a lawyer. It was thought that Rollins probably had a fear of becoming an alcoholic himself and dying from it. He did not like drinking anything and did not want anyone around him drinking anything either. He had a lifelong crusade to stop it. Of course, later on, it was a bit difficult to stop officers from drinking at Army headquarters. After a battle with 20,000 casualties, everyone tends to self-medicate at times. Once the war started and Grant got a position, he hired Rollins as his adjutant general. Rollins could not make it at first because his wife was dying. Senator Washburn, a friend of Rollins, wrote Grant that he was concerned that his friend Rollins wouldn't get the position because he couldn't take it right away. Grant assured him he would save the place for Rollins. Rollins could do two things very well. One was swearing and the other was scolding. Grant had never said a swear word in his life, but he used to joke that he kept Rollins around to do his swearing for him. As for scolding, Grant ignored it. Rollins helped with administration, but he was no writer. Grant wrote all his own dispatches during the war. Rawlins, Wyoming is named after him. Grant also met John Hyle Vincent. He was a young minister at Grant's Methodist Church in Galena, but they didn't get acquainted until they were both at the same hotel in another city, and Grant recognized him and introduced himself. He later founded Chautauqua in New York and asked President Grant to speak at the opening. Chautauqua is a social movement and adult education program that was popular in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It features lectures, concerts, plays, and other forms of entertainment and education. It brought a whole new world to rural areas. Elihu Washburn. He was an influential congressman who was born in Maine and moved to Galena. He had two brothers who were also in Congress representing other states. Pretty good for some kids who grew up in a very poor background. He was impressed by Grant and persuaded Lincoln to make him a brigadier general. Washburn advocated for Grant's promotions in the Union Army and protected him from critics in Washington and in the field. Washburn was Grant's advocate in Congress throughout the war, and their friendship and association lasted through Grant's 2 terms as president. This is Governor Yates. Yates was the governor of Illinois when war broke out. He was very supportive of the war effort and anti-slavery. He took energetic measures to secure Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri against rebel attack, and he helped organize the Illinois contingent of Union soldiers and commissioned U.S. Grant, among others, as a colonel for an Illinois regiment. He supported the Emancipation Proclamation, and as a senator, he supported the impeachment and removal of President Andrew Johnson from office. This is a drawing of the Wide Awakes doing one of their marches. The Wide Awakes were a Republican political organization that was dedicated to electing Abraham Lincoln to the White House. What distinguished them from other political clubs of the 19th century were their youth, their effectiveness, their uniforms, and their torchlight parades where they marched in unison. They wore uniforms of identical hats and capes made of enamel canvas. After Lincoln was elected, they were among the first to join the Army. When they were marching in Galena, they asked Grant to help them march correctly, and he did help them. The attack on Fort Sumter. This depicts Major Anderson of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, April 12th through April 14th, 1861. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the official beginning of the American Civil War, a war that lasted 4 years, cost the lives of more than 620,000 Americans, and freed 3.9 million enslaved people from bondage. Lincoln's strategy was not to attack the South, but to let them attack the Union, and then Lincoln would be practicing self-defense when he started raising troops. They fell for it. 2 meetings at the courthouse. After the Fort Sumter attack, the community met in the courthouse to discuss the event. Speakers expressed their opinions. Pro-secession or pro-slavery opinions were dangerous to express. Rawlins delivered a stirring 45-minute address. Washburn also spoke. The next meeting, soon after that one, was to discuss how to raise troops. They elected Grant as the chairman of that meeting. This had to be the hardest thing Grant ever did because he did not speak in public. He had decided that back in grade school, and he was sticking to it. He did run it, however, in a very awkward way. He spoke to them about what they could expect of Army life. He declined the captaincy they offered him, but volunteered to drill the company and help design uniforms and escort them to Springfield. Washburn told Grant to see the governor when he got to Springfield, but when he got there, it was impossible because the crush of people wanting positions. That evening, Grant and the governor were dining in the same hotel. Grant had decided to go home the next day. After dinner, Governor Yates came up and told him that he heard that he was going home tomorrow, but instead he should drop by the State House. The next morning, he hired him to help with the clerical work. A disappointment, but Grant took it. He helped state workers figure out federal forms. Because he got good reports, Yates next hired him to muster in volunteers all over the state. He was so popular with one unit, they named their camp Camp Grant. When that was over, he was out of a job. Yates could have appointed him to be colonel of a regiment, but he didn't. Some historians blame the drinking rumor, but that seems a little far-fetched. This guy was an unknown at the time. How would anyone there who knew nothing about the Army know about the drinking rumor? And besides that, Yates showed up to many meetings totally drunk, so why would that concern him? Grant was determined to get back in the Army. First, he wrote a letter to Washington, D.C., offering his services. He never heard back. After the Civil War was over, they found the letter at the bottom of a drawer in the War Department. Next, he went to see McClellan in Cincinnati. McClellan had been made general of the Western region. For 2 days in a row, he sat on a bench in the outer office watching clerks who were so busy with their pencils stuck behind their ears that they had no time for him. Many historians conclude that the reason McClellan refused to see him was he remembered a Grant drinking binge at Columbia Barracks in Oregon. So, on his way back from trying to see McClellan, he stopped by a West Point friend's house. He asked his friend if he knew of any openings. The friend said he had some ideas and he actually came up with a couple of offers for Grant. Before those came in, a telegram from Yates offering him command of the 21st Regiment caught up with Grant at the friend's house. The Illinois 21 that had an electric colonel. The colonel turned out to be a ne'er-do-well who liked to drink and carouse more than the men. The 1,000-man regiment of young farm boys was completely out of control and becoming embarrassing. They were being called Governor Yates' hellions. The volunteers, with their elected colonel, were going out drinking every night and raising hell. When they weren't drinking, they were stealing livestock from the people living in the vicinity. The colonel tried putting in a goon squad of 80 men with clubs to roam the grounds, but order was not improved. When the telegram arrived at his friend's house offering him the position, he immediately accepted. The regiment camp was at the fairgrounds. The house you see in the picture was the regimental headquarters. It was later moved to a neighborhood, but at that time it was located on the state fairgrounds. Grant walked onto the grounds wearing worn-out civilian clothes and a beaten-up hat. He went into the office and told them that he guessed he would take command. Later, as he was walking around the fairgrounds, checking out the situation, some of the out-of-control farm boys were aping him from behind, and one knocked off his hat. When Grant turned around to pick up the hat, the men noticed there was no fear in his eyes.